Good morning and welcome back to my channel. I'm the Loyal Hufflepuff, and today we will continue our reading in Siege and Storm. This is the second book of a trilogy titled Shadow and Bone, and this is going to be based off of this next season of the Netflix series Shadow and Bone, and I'm assuming that next season is going to be based off the second book of a duology titled Six of Crows. I'm looking forward to reading this, continue reading this with you guys, and if you have any comments, please write down below about your comments and what your thoughts are about Siege and Storm. I haven't gotten much in the way of information about the next season, other than it's going to be coming out, I think it was early next year, and there's going to be a game coming out titled Shadow and Bone Destinies. Again, I'm looking forward to seeing those coming out, and let's continue reading Siege and Storm. Don't mind the dogs; they're gonna be coming on and off the couch, or they may bark like that. Ah, Maisie. Rosalie was a folk story, a fairy tale. A creature of dreams that lived on the edges of maps. But there could be no doubt the ice dragon was real, and Maul had found it, just as he had found the stag. It felt wrong, like everything was happening too quickly, as if we were rushing towards something we didn't understand. A shout from the longboats drew my attention. A man on the boat nearest to the sea whip stood up, a harpoon in his hand, taking aim, but the dragon's white tail lashed through the sea, split the waves, and came down with a slap, sending a rolling wall of water up against the boat's hull. The man with the harpoon sat down hard as the longboat tipped precariously, then righted itself at the last moment. Good, I thought. Fight them. Then the other boat let fly their harpoons. The first went wide and splashed harmlessly in the water. The second lodged in the sea whip's hide. It bucked, tail whipping back and forth, then reared up like a snake, hurling its body out of the water. For a moment it hung suspended in the air, translucent, wing-like fins, gleaming scales, and wrathful red eyes. Beads of water flew from its mane, and its massive jaws opened, revealing a pink tongue and rows of gleaming teeth. It came down on the nearest boat with a loud crash of splintering wood. The slender craft split in two, and men poured into the sea. The dragon's maw snapped closed over a sailor's legs, and he vanished, screaming beneath the waves. With furious strokes, the rest of the crewmen swam through the blood-stained water, making for the remaining longboat, where they were hauled over the side. I glanced back up to the whaler's rigging. The tops of the masts were shrouded in mist now, but I could still make out the light of Timar's lantern burning steadily atop the main royal. Another harpoon found its target, and the sea whip began to sing, a sound more lovely than anything I'd ever heard. A choir of voices lifted in a plaintive, wordless song. No, I realized, not a song. The sea whip was crying out, writhing and rolling in the waves as the longboats gave chase, struggling to shake the hooked tips of the harpoons free. Fight, I pleaded silently. Once he has you, he'll never let you go. But I could already see the sea dragon slowing, its movements growing sluggish as its cries wavered, mournful now, their music bleak and fading. Part of me wished the Darkling would just end it. Why didn't he? Why not use the cut on the sea whip and bind me to him as he had done with the stag? Nets, shouted Sturmhund, but the mist had grown so thick that I couldn't quite tell where his voice was coming from. I heard a series of thunks from somewhere near the starboard rail. Clear the mist, ordered the Darkling. We're losing the longboat. I heard the Grisha calling to one another, and then felt the billow of squalor winds tugging at the hem of my coat. The mist lifted and my jaw dropped. The Darkling and his Grisha still stood on the starboard side, attention focused on the longboat that now seemed to be rowing away from the whaler. But on the port side, another ship had appeared as if from nowhere, a sleek schooner with gleaming masts and colors flying. A red dog on a teal field, and below it, in pale blue and gold, the Rufkin Double Eagle. I heard another series of thunks and saw steel claws studding the whaler's portside rail. Grappling hooks, I realized. And then, everything seemed to happen at once. A howl went up from somewhere, like a wolf baying at the moon. Men swarmed over the rail onto the whaler's deck, pistols strapped to their chests, cutlasses in their hands, yelling and barking like a pack of wild dogs. I saw the Darkling turn, confusion and rage on his face. "What is going on?" Maul said, stepping in front of me as he edged toward the meager protection of the mizzenmast. "I don't know," I replied. "Something very good or something very, very bad." We stood back to back, my hands still trapped in irons. His still bound, powerless to defend ourselves as the deck erupted into fighting. Pistol shots rang out. The air came alive with infernal fire. "To me, hounds!" Sturmhund shouted, and plunged into the action. A saber in his hands. Barking, yipping, snarling men were descending on the Darkling Grisha from all sides, not just from the railing of the schooner, but from the rigging of the whaler as well. Sturmhund's men. Sturmhund was turning against the Darkling. The privateer had clearly lost his mind. Yes, the Grisha were outnumbered, but numbers didn't matter in a fight with the Darkling. "Look!" Maul shouted. Down in the water, the men in the remaining longboat had the struggling sea whip in tow. They had raised a sail, and a brisk wind was driving them, not toward the whaler, but directly toward the schooner instead. The stiff breeze that carried them seemed to come from nowhere. I looked closer. A crewman was standing in the longboat, arms raised. There was no mistaking it. Sturmhund had a squaller working for him. Suddenly, an arm seized me around the waist, and I was lifted off my feet. The world seemed to upend itself, and I shrieked as I was thrown over a huge shoulder. I lifted my head, struggling against the arm that held me like a steel band, and saw Timor rushing toward Maul, a knife gleaming in her hands. "No!" I screamed. "Maul!" He put up his hands to defend himself, but all she did was slice through his bonds. "Go!" she shouted, tossing him the knife and drawing a sword from the scabbard at her hip. Tolia clutched me tighter as he sprinted over the deck. Timor and Maul were close behind. "What are you doing?" I squawked, my head jouncing against the giant's back. "Just run," Timor replied, slashing at a cripple-nick who threw himself into her path. "I can't run," I shouted back. "Your idiot brother has me slung over his shoulder like a ham." Do you want to be rescued or not?" I didn't have time to answer. "Hold tight," Tolia said. "We're going over." I squeezed my eyes shut, preparing to tumble into the icy water. But Tolia hadn't gone more than a few steps when he gave a sudden grunt and fell to one knee. Losing his grip on me, I toppled to the deck and rolled clumsily onto my side. When I looked up, I saw Ivan and a blue-robed Inferni standing over us. Ivan's hand was outstretched. He was crushing Tolia's heart, and this time, Sturmhund wasn't there to stop him. The Inferni advanced on Tamar and Maul, flint in hand, arm already moving in an arc of flame. Over before it began, I thought miserably. But in the next moment, the Inferni stopped and gasped. His flames died on the air. "What are you waiting for?" Ivan snarled. The Inferni's only response was a choked hiss. His eyes bulged. He clawed at his throat. Tamar held her sword in her right hand, but he left but her left fist was clenched. Good trick, she said, swatting away the paralyzed Inferni's flint. I know a good trick, too. She raised her blade, and as the Inferni stood helpless, desperate for air, she ran him through with one vicious thrust. The Inferni crumpled to the deck. Ivan stared in confusion at Tamar standing over the lifeless body, her sword dripping blood. His concentration must have wavered because in that moment, Tolya came up from his knee with a terrifying roar. Ivan clenched his fist, refocusing his efforts. Tolya grimaced, but he did not fall. Then the giant's hand shot out, and Ivan's face spasmed in pain and the bewilderment. I looked from Tolya to Tamar, realization dawning. They were Grisha, heartrenders. Do you like that little man? Tolya asked as he stalked toward Ivan. Desperately, Ivan cast out another hand. He was shaking, and I could see he was struggling for breath. Tolya bobbled slightly, but kept coming. Now we learn who has the stronger heart, he growled. He strode slowly forward, like he was walking against a hard wind, his face beaded with sweat, his teeth bared in feral glee. I wondered if he and Ivan would both just fall down dead. Then the fingers of Tolya's outstretched hand curled into a fist. Ivan convulsed. His eyes rolled up in his head. A bubble of blood blossomed and burst on his lips. He collapsed onto the deck. Dimly, I was aware of the chaos raging around me. Tamar was struggling with a squalor. Two other Grisha had leapt onto Tolya. I heard a gunshot and realized Maul had gotten hold of a pistol, but all I could see was Ivan's lifeless body. He was dead. The Darkling's right hand, one of the most powerful heartrenders in the Second Army. He'd survived the Fold and the Volcra, and now he was dead. A tiny sob drew out of my reverie. Genya stood gazing down at Ivan, her hands over her mouth. Genya, I said, stop them. Stop them, the shout came from across the deck. I turned and saw the Darkling grappling with an armed sailor. Genya was shaking. She reached into the pocket of her kefta and drew out a pistol. Tolya lunged toward her. No, I said, stepping between them. I wasn't going to watch him kill Genya. The heavy pistol trembled in her hand. Genya, I said quietly, are you going to shoot me? She looked around wildly, unsure of where to aim. I laid a hand on her sleeve. She flinched and turned to the barrel on me. A crack like thunder rent the air, and I knew the Darkling had gotten free. I looked back and saw a wave of darkness tumbling toward us. It's over, I thought. We're done for. But in the next instant, I glimpsed a bright flash and a shot rang out. The swell of darkness blew away to nothing, and I saw the Darkling clutching his arm. His face contorted in fury and pain. In disbelief, I realized he'd been shot. Sturmhund was racing toward us, pistols in hand. Run! He shouted. Come on, Alina! Maul cried, reaching for my arm. Genya, I said desperately, come with us. Her hand was shaking so badly, I thought the pistol might fly from her grip. Tears spilled over her cheeks. I can't, she sobbed brokenly. She lowered her weapon. Go, Alina, she said. Just go. In the next instant, Tolya had tossed me over his shoulder. Again, I beat futilely at his broad back. No, I yelled. Wait! But no one paid me any mind. Tolya took a running leap and vaulted over the railing. I screamed as we plummeted toward the icy water, bracing for the impact. Instead, we were scooped up by what could only have been a squalor, wind and deposited on the attacking schooner's deck. With a bone-jarring thud, Tamar and Maul followed, with Sturmhund close behind. Give the signal, Sturmhund shouted, springing to his feet. A piercing whistle blew. Privyet, he called to a crewman I didn't recognize. How many do we have? 8 men down, replied Privyet. 4 remaining on the whaler. Cargo on its way up. Saints, Sturmhund swore. He looked back to the whaler, struggling with himself. Musketeers, he shouted to the men on the schooner's mini top. Lend them cover. The musketeers began firing their rifles down onto the deck of the whaler. Tolia tossed Maul a rifle, then slung another over his back. He leapt into the rigging and began to climb. Tamar drew a pistol from her hip. I was still sprawled on the deck in an undignified tangle. My hands held useless in irons. Sea whip is secured, Capitan, shouted Privyet. 2 more of Sturmhund's men hurled over the whaler's railing and flew through the air, arms pinwheeling wildly to crash in a heap on the schooner's deck. One was bleeding badly from a wound to his arm. Then it came again, the boom of thunder. He's up, called Tamar. Blackness tumbled toward us, engulfing the schooner, blotting out everything in its path. Free me, I pleaded. Let me help. Sturmhund threw Tamar the keys and shouted, Do it. Tamar reached for my wrists, fumbling with the key as darkness rolled over us. We were blind. I heard someone scream. Then the lock clicked free. The irons fell from my wrists and hit the deck with a dull clang. I raised my hands, and light blazed through the dark, pushing the blackness back over the whaler. A cheer went up from Sturmhund's crew, but it withered on their lips as another sound filled the air. A grating shriek, piercing in its wrongness, the creak of a door swinging open. A door that should have remained forever shut. The wound in my shoulder gave a sharp throb. Neshivoya. I turned to Sturmhund. We have to get out of here, I said. Now! He hesitated, battling himself. 2 of his men were still aboard the whaler. His expression hardened. Top men, make sail, he shouted. Squallers, due east. I saw a row of sailors standing by the mast raise their arms and heard a whump as the canvas above us swelled with a hard-driving wind. Just how many Grisha did the privateer have in his crew? But the darkling squallers had arranged themselves on the whaler's deck and were sending their own winds to buffet us. The schooner rocked unsteadily. Port side guns, roared Sturmhund. Rolling broadside. On my signal. I heard 2 shrill whistle blasts. A deafening boom shook the ship. Then another, and another, as the schooner's guns opened up a gaping hole in the whaler's hull. A panicked shout went up in the darkling ship. Sturmhund's squallers seized the advantage, and the schooner surged free. As the smoke from the cannons cleared, I saw a figure in black step up to the railing of the disabled whaler. Another wave of darkness rushed toward us, but this one was different. It writhed over the water as if it were clawing its way forward, and with it came the eerie clicking of 1,000 angry insects. The darkness frothed and foamed, like a wave breaking over a shoulder, and began to separate itself into shapes beside me. Maul muttered a prayer and lifted his rifle to his shoulder. I focused my power and slashed out with the cut, burning through the black cloud, trying to destroy the Nishivoya before they could take their full form. But I couldn't stop them all. They came on in a moaning horde of black teeth and claws. Sturmhund's crew opened fire. The Nishivoya reached the masts of the schooner, whirling around the sails, plucking sailors from the rigging like fruit. Then they were skittering down onto the deck. Maul fired again and again as the crewmen drew their sabers, but bullets and blades seemed only to slow the monsters. Their shadow bodies wavered and reformed, and they just kept coming. The schooner was still moving ahead, widening the distance between itself and the whaler. Not fast enough. I heard that shrieking moan, and another wave of shifting, slithering dark was headed toward us. already separating into winged bodies, reinforcements from the soldiers. Sturman saw it too. He pointed to one of the squallers still summoning wind to the sails. Lightning, he shouted. I flinched. I couldn't. He couldn't mean it. Squallers were never permitted to draw lightning. It was too unpredictable, too dangerous. And on open seas? With wooden ships. With wooden ships? But Sturmhand's Grisha didn't hesitate. The squallers clapped their hands together, rubbing their palms back and forth. My ears popped as the pressure plummeted. The air crackled with current. He had just enough time to hurl ourselves to the deck as jagged bolts of lightning zigzagged across the sky. The new wave of Nishovia scattered in momentary confusion. Go, Sturman bellowed. Squallers at full. Maul and I were thrown against the railing as the schooner shot forward. The sleek ship seemed to fly over the waves. I saw another black swell billow out from the side of the whaler. I lurched to my feet and braced myself, gathering my strength for another onslaught. But it did not come. It seemed there was a limit to the Darkling's power. We'd edged out of his range. I leaned over the railing. The wind and sea spray stung my skin as the Darkling ship and his monsters disappeared from view. Something between a laugh and a sob racked my chest. Maul threw his arm around me, and I held tight, feeling the wet press of his shirt against my cheek. Listening to the pounding of his heart, clinging to the unbelievable truth that we were still alive. Then, despite the blood they'd shed and the friends they'd lost, the schooner's crew broke into cheers. They whooped and hollered and barked and growled in the rigging. Tolyash lifted his rifle with one hand and threw his head back, releasing a howl of triumph that lifted the hair on my arms. Maul and I drew apart, gazing at the crewmen yipping and laughing around us. I knew we were both thinking the same thing. Just what had we gotten ourselves into? End of chapter 4 and beginning chapter 5. We slumped back against the railing and scooted down until we were seated beside each other, exhausted and dazed. We'd escaped the Darkling, but we were on a strange ship, surrounded by a bunch of crazed Grisha dressed as sailors and howling like mad dogs. You all right? Maul asked. I nodded. The wound in my shoulder felt like it was on fire, but I was unhurt, and my whole body was thrumming from using my power again. You? I asked. Not a scratch on me, Maul said in disbelief. The ship rode the waves at seemingly impossible speed, driven forward by squallers, and what I realized were tidemakers. As the terror and thrill of the battle receded, I noticed I was soaked. My teeth began to chatter. Maul put his arm around me, and at some point, one of the crew dropped a blanket over us. Finally, Sturmhund called a halt and ordered the sailors trimmed. The squallers and tidemakers dropped their arms and fell against each other, completely spent. Their power had left their faces glowing, their eyes alight. The schooner slowed until it rocked gently in what suddenly seemed like an overwhelming silence. Keep a watch, Sturman commanded, and Privyet sent a sailor up into the shrouds with a long glass. Maul and I slowly got to our feet. Sturman walked down the row of exhausted Earthralki, clapping squallers and tidemakers on the back and saying quiet words to a few of them. I saw him directing injured sailors below decks, where I assumed they'd be seen by a ship's surgeon or maybe a corporal key healer. The privateers seemed to have every kind of Grisha in his employ. Then Sturmhund strode toward me, pulling a knife from his belt. My hands went up, and Maul stepped in front of me, leveling his rifle at Sturmhund's chest. Instantly, I heard swords being drawn and pistols cocking all around us as the crew drew their weapons. Easy, Oretsev, Sturmhund said, his steps slowing. I've just gone to a lot of trouble and expense to put you on my ship. Be ashamed to fill you full of holes now. He flipped the knife over, offering the hilt to me. This is for the beast. The sea whip. In the excitement of the battle, I'd almost forgotten. Maul hesitated, then cautiously lowered his rifle. Stand down, Sturman instructed his crew. They holstered their pistols and put up their swords. Sturmhund nodded to Tamar. Haul it in. On Tamar's orders, a group of sailors leaned over the starboard rail and unlashed a complex webbing of ropes. They heaved and slowly raised the sea whip's body over the schooner's side. It thumped to the deck, still struggling weakly in the silvery confines of the net. It gave a vicious thrash, its huge teeth snapping. We all jumped back. As I understand it, you have to be the one, said Sturmhund, holding the knife out to me once more. I eyed the privateer, wondering how much he might know about amplifiers, and this amplifier in particular. Go on, he said. We need to get moving. The Darkling ship is disabled, but it won't stay that way. The blade in Sturmhund's hand gleamed dully in the sun. Grecian steel. Somehow I wasn't surprised. Still, I hesitated. I just lost 13 good men, Sturmhund said quietly. Don't tell me it was all for nothing. I looked at the sea whip. It lay twitching on the deck, air fluttering through its gills. Its red eyes cloudy, but still full of rage. I remembered the stag's dark, steady gaze, the quiet panic of its final moments. The stag had lived so long in my imagination that when it had finally stepped from the trees and into the snowy glade, it had been almost familiar to me, known. The sea whip was a stranger, more myth than reality, despite the sad and solid truth of its broken body. Either way, it won't survive, the privateer said. I grasped the knife's hilt. It felt heavy in my hand. Is this mercy? It certainly wasn't the same mercy I had shown Rose of a stag. Rusali, the cursed prince, guardian of the Bone Road. In the stories, he lured lonely maidens onto his back and carried them, laughing over the waves, until they were too far from shore to cry for help. Then he dove down, dragging them beneath the surface of his underwater palace. The girls wasted away, for there was nothing to eat there but coral and pearls. Rusali wept and sang his mournful song over their bodies, then returned to the surface to claim another queen. Just stories, I told myself. It's not a prince, just an animal in pain. The sea whip's sides heaved. It snapped its jaws uselessly in the air. 2 harpoons extended from its back, watery blood trickling from the wounds. I held up the knife, unsure of what to do, where to put the blade. My arm shook. The sea whip gave a wheezing, pitiful sigh, a weak echo of that magical choir. Maul strode forward. End it, Alina, he said hoarsely. For Saint's sake. He pulled the knife from my grip and dropped it to the deck. He took hold of my hands and closed them over the shaft of one of the harpoons. With one clean thrust, we drove it home. The sea whip shuddered and then went still, its blood pooling on the deck. Maul looked down at his hands, then wiped them on his torn shirt and turned away. Tolia and Timur came forward. My stomach churned. I knew what had to come next. That isn't true, said a voice in my head. You can walk away. Leave it be. Again, I had the sense that things were moving too fast. But I couldn't just throw an amplifier like this back into the sea. The dragon had already given up its life. and taking the amplifier didn't necessarily mean that I would use it. The sea whip scales were an iridescent white that shimmered with soft rainbows, except for a single strip that began between its large eyes and ran over the ridge of its skull into its soft mane. Those were edged in gold. Tamar slid a dagger from her belt and, with Tulia's help, worked the scales free. I didn't let myself look away. When they were done, they handed me 7 perfect scales, still wet with blood. Let us bow our heads for the men lost today, Sturmhond said. Good sailors, good soldiers. Let the sea carry them to safe harbor, and may the saints receive them on a brighter shore. He repeated the sailor's prayer in courage. Then Tamar murmured the words in Shu. For a moment we stood on the rocking ship, heads bent. A lump rose in my throat. More men dead, and another magical ancient creature gone, its body desecrated by Grisha steel. I laid my hand on the sea whip's shimmering hide. It was cool and slick beneath my fingers. Its red eyes were cloudy and blank. I gripped the golden scales in my palm, feeling their edges dig into my flesh. What saints waited for creatures like this? A long minute passed, and then Sturmhund murmured, Saints receive them. Saints receive them, replied the crew. We need to move, Sturmhund said quietly. The whaler's hull was cracked, but the Darkling has squallers and a fabricator or two. And for all I know, those monsters of his can be trained to use a hammer and nails. Let's not take any chances. He turned to Privyet. Give the squallers a few minutes to rest and get me a damage report, then make sail. Da, Capitan, Privyet responded crisply. He hesitated. Capitan, could be people will pay good money for dragon scales, no matter the color. Sturmhund frowned, but then gave a terse nod. Take what you want, then clear the deck and get us moving. You have our coordinates. Several of the crew fell on the sea whip's body to cut away its scales. This I couldn't watch. I turned my back on them, my gut in knots. Sturmhund came up beside me. Don't judge them too harshly, he said, glancing over his shoulder. It's not them I'm judging, I said. You're the captain. And they have purses to fill, parents and siblings to feed. We just lost nearly half our crew, and took no rich prize to ease the sting. Not that you aren't fetching. What am I doing here? I asked. Why did you help us? Are you sure I have? Are you so sure I have? Answer the question, Sturmhond, said Maul, joining us. Why hunt the sea whip if you only meant to turn it over to Alina? I wasn't hunting the sea whip. I was hunting you. That's why you raised a mutiny against the Darkling? I asked. To get at me? You can't very well mutiny on your own ship. Call it what you like, I said, exasperated. Just explain yourself. Sturmhund leaned back and rested his elbows on the rail, surveying the deck. As I would have explained to the Darkling, had he bothered to ask, which thankfully he didn't. The problem with hiring a man who sells his honor is that you can always be outbid. I gaped at him. You betrayed the Darkling for money? Betrayed seems like a strong word. I hardly know the fellow. You're mad, I said. You know what he can do. No prize is worth that. Sturmhund grinned. That remains to be seen. The Darkling will hunt you for the rest of your days. Then you and I will have something in common, won't we? Besides, I like to have powerful enemies. Makes me feel important. Maul crossed his arms and considered the privateer. I can't decide if you're crazy or stupid. I have so many good qualities, Sturmhund said. It can be hard to choose. I shook my head. The privateer was out of his mind. If the Darkling was outbid, then who hired you? Where are you taking us? First answer a question for me, Sturmhond said, reaching into the frock coat. He drew a little red volume from his pocket and tossed it to me. Why was the Darkling carrying this around with him? He doesn't strike me as the religious type. I caught it and turned it over, but I already knew what it was. Its gold lettering sparkled in the sun. You stole it? I asked. And a number of other documents from his cabin. Although, again, since it was technically my cabin, I'm not sure you can call it theft. Technically, I observed in irritation, the cabin belongs to the whaling captain you stole the ship from. Fair enough, admitted Sturmhund. If this whole sun summoner thing doesn't work out, you might consider a career as a barrister. You seem to have the carping disposition. But I should point out that this actually belongs to you. He reached out and flipped the book open. My name was inscribed inside the cover. Alina Starkov. I tried to keep my face blank, but my mind was suddenly racing. This was my History Sanctia, the very copy the apparat had given to me months ago in the library of the little palace. The Darkling would have had my room searched after I fled Oz Alta. But why take this book? And why had he been so concerned that I might have read it? I thumbed through the pages. The volume was beautifully illustrated, though given that it was meant for children, it was awfully gruesome. Some of the saints were depicted performing miracles or acts of charity. Saint Felix among the apple boughs, Saint Anastasia ridding Arkisk of the wasting plague, but most of the pages showed the saints in their martyrdoms. Saint Elisabetta being drawn and quartered, the beheading of Saint Lubov, Saint Ilya in chains. I froze. This time I could not disguise my reaction. Interesting, no? Said Sturmhund. He tapped the page with one long finger. Unless I'm very much mistaken, that's the creature we just captured. There was no hiding it. Behind Saint Ila, splashing around in the waves of a lake or an ocean, was the distinctive shape of the sea whip. But that wasn't all. Somehow, I kept my hand from straying to the collar at my neck. I shut the book and shrugged. Just another story. Maul shot me a baffled look. I didn't know if he'd seen what was on that page. I didn't want to return to History Sanctia to Sturmhund, but he was already suspicious enough. I made myself hold it out to him, hoping he couldn't see the tremor in my hand. Sturmhund studied me, then levered himself up and shook out his cuffs. Keep it. It is yours, after all. As I'm sure you've noticed, I have a deep respect for personal property. Besides, you'll need something to keep you occupied until we get to Oskurvo. Maul and I both gave a start. You're taking us to West Ravka? I asked. I'm taking you to meet my client. And that's really all I can tell you. Who is he? What does he want from me? Are you sure it's a he? Maybe I'm delivering you to a Verdun queen. Are you? No, but it's always wise to keep an open mind. I blew out a frustrated breath. Do you ever answer a question directly? Hard to say. Ah, there, I've done it again. I turned to Maul, fist clenched. I'm going to kill him. Answer the question, Sturmhund, Maul growled. Sturmhund lifted a brow. 2 things you should know, he said, and this time I heard that hint of steel in his voice. 1, captains don't like taking orders on their own ships. 2, I'd like to offer you a deal. Maul snorted. Why would we ever trust you? You don't have much choice, Sturmhund said pleasantly. I'm well aware that you could sink this ship and consign us all to the watery deep, but I hope you'll take your chances with my client. Listen to what he has to say. If you don't like what he proposes, I swear to help you make your escape, take you anywhere in the world. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. So you crossed the Darkling, and now you're going to turn right around and betray your new client too? Not at all, said Sturmhund, genuinely affronted. My client paid me to get you to Ravka, not to keep you there. That would be extra. I looked at Maul. He lifted a shoulder and said, He's a liar and probably insane, but he's also right. We don't have much choice. I rubbed my temples. I felt a headache coming on. I was tired and confused. And Sturmhund had a way of talking that made me want to shoot someone, preferably him. But he'd freed us from the Darkling, and when Maul and I were off his ship, we might find our own way to escape. For now, I couldn't think much beyond that. All right, I said. He smiled. So good to know you won't be drowning us all. He beckoned the deckhand who had been hovering nearby. Fetch Tamar and tell her she'll be sharing her quarters with the summoner, he instructed. Then he pointed to Maul. He can stay with Tolia. Before Maul could open his mouth to protest, Sturmhund forestalled him. That's the way of things on this ship. I'm giving you both free run of the Volni until we reach Ravka, but I beg you not to trifle with my generous nature. The ship has rules, and I have limits. You and me both, Maul said through gritted teeth. I laid my hand on Maul's arm. I would have felt safer staying together, but this wasn't the time to quibble with the privateer. Let it go, I said. I'll be fine. Maul scowled, then turned on his heel and strode across the deck, disappearing into the ordered chaos of rope and sail. I took a step after him. I want to leave him alone, Sturmhund said. That type needs plenty of time for brooding and self-recrimination. Otherwise, they get cranky. Do you take anything seriously? No, not if I can help it. Makes life so tedious. I shook my head. This client. Don't bother asking. Needless to say, I've had plenty of bidders. You're in very high demand since you disappeared from the fold. Of course, most people think you're dead. Tends to drive the price down. Try not to take it personally. I looked across the deck to where the crew were hefting the Sea Whip's body over the ship's rail. With a straining heave, they rolled it over the side of the schooner. It struck the water with a loud splash. That quickly, Rusalai was gone, swallowed by the sea. A long whistle blew. The crewmen scattered to their stations, and the squallers took their places. Seconds later, the sails bloomed like great white flowers. The schooner was once more on its way, tacking southeast to Ravka, to home. What are you going to do with those scales? Sturmhund asked. I don't know. Don't you? Despite my dazzling good looks, I'm not quite the pretty fool I appeared to be. The Darkling intended for you to wear the Sea Whip scales. So why didn't he kill it when the Darkling had murdered the stag and placed Morozova's collar around my neck? He'd bound us forever. I shivered, remembering the way he had reached across that connection, seizing hold of my power as I stood by, helpless. Would the dragon's scales have given him the same control? And if so, why not take it? I already have an amplifier, I said. A powerful one, if the stories are true. The most powerful amplifier the world had ever known. So the Darkling had told me, and so I'd believed. But what if there was more to it? What if I'd only touched the beginnings of the stag's power? I shook my head. That was madness. Amplifiers can't be combined. I saw the book, he replied. It certainly looks like they can. I felt the weight of the Histoire Sanctia in my pocket. Had the Darkling feared I might learn Rosa's secrets from the pages of a children's book? You don't understand what you're saying, I told Sturmhond. No Grisha has ever taken a second amplifier. The risks. Now, what's a word best not used around here? Around me. Now, that's a word best not used around me. I tend to be over fond of risk. Not this kind, I said grimly. Pity, he murmured. If the Darkling catches up to us, I doubt this ship and this crew will survive another battle. A second amplifier might even the odds, but yet give us an edge. I do not hate a fair fight. I do so hate a fair fight. Or it would kill me or sink the ship, or create another Shadowfold, or worse. You certainly have a flair for the dire. My fingers snaked into my pocket, seeking out the damp edges of the scales. I had so little information, and my knowledge of Grisha theory was sketchy at best. But this rule had always seemed fairly clear. One Grisha, one amplifier. I remembered the words from one of the convoluted philosophy texts I'd been required to read. Why can a Grisha possess but one amplifier? I will answer this question instead. What is infinite? The universe and the greed of men. I needed time to think. Will you keep your word? I said at last. Will you help us escape? Okay. Will you help us escape? I didn't know why I bothered asking. If he intended to betray us, he certainly wouldn't say so. Excuse me. I expected him to reply with some kind of joke, so I was surprised when he said, Are you so eager to leave your country behind once again? I stilled. All the while your country suffers, the Darkling had accused of me abandoning Ravka. He was wrong about a lot of things, but I couldn't help feeling that he was right about that. I left my country to the mercy of the Shadowfold, to a weak king and grasping tyrants like the Darkling and the Apparat. Now, if the rumors could be believed, the fold was expanding, and Ravka was falling apart. Because of the Darkling, because of the Caller, because of me. I lifted my face to the sun, feeling the rush of sea air over my skin, and said, I'm eager to be free. As long as the Darkling lives, you'll never be free. And neither will your country. You know that. I'd considered the possibility that Sturmhund was greedy or stupid, but it hadn't occurred to me that he might actually be a patriot. He was Ravkan, after all, and even if his exploits had lined his own pockets, they'd probably done more to help his country than all of the feeble Ravkan navy. Ooh, I want the choice, I said. You'll have it, he replied. On my word as a liar and cutthroat. He set off across the deck, but then turned back to me. You're right about one thing, Summoner. The Darkling is a powerful enemy. You might want to think about making some powerful friends. I wanted nothing more than to pull the copy of the Histoire Sanctia from my pocket and spend an hour studying the illustration of Sankt Ilya. But Tamar was already waiting to escort me to her quarters. Sturmhund's schooner wasn't at all like the sturdy merchant ship that had carried Maul and me to Novi Zem, or the clunky whaler we just left behind. It was sleek, heavily armed, and beautifully built. Tamar told me that he'd captured the schooner from a Zemeni pirate who was picking off Rafkin ships near the ports of the southern coast. Sturmhund had liked the vessel so much that he'd taken it for his own flagship and renamed it Volkvolny, Wolf of the Waves. Wolves, Stormhound, the red dog on the ship's flag. At least I knew why the crew were always howling and yapping. Every inch of space on the schooner was put to use. The crew slept on the gun deck. In case of engagement, their hammocks could be quickly stowed and the cannon slotted into place. I'd been right about the fact that, with Corporal Key on board, there was no need for an Otka, Otkazatia surgeon. The doctor's quarters and supply room had been turned into Tamar's berth. The cabin was tiny, with barely enough room for 2 hammocks and a chest. The walls were lined with cupboards full of unused ointments and salves, arsenic powder, tincture of lead, antimony. Excuse me. I balanced carefully in one of the hammocks, my feet resting on the floor, acutely conscious of the red book tucked inside my coat, as I watched Tamar throw open the lid of her trunk and begin divesting herself of weapons. The brace of pistols that crossed her chest, 2 slender axes from her belt, a dagger from her boot, and another from the sheath secured around her thigh. She was a walking armory. I feel sorry for your friend, she said as she pulled what looked like a sock full of ball bearings from one of her pockets. It hit the bottom of the chest with a loud thunk. Why? I asked, making a circle on the planks with the toe of my boot. My brother snores like a drunk bear. I laughed. Maud snores too. Then they can perform a duet. She disappeared and then returned a moment later with a bucket. The tide makers filled the rain barrels, she said. Feel free to wash yourself. Feel free to wash if you like. Fresh water was usually a luxury aboard ship. But I suppose that with Grisha and the crew, there would be no need to ration. Excuse me. She dunked her head in the bucket and ruffled her short, dark hair. He's handsome, the tracker. I rolled my eyes. You don't say. Not my type, but handsome. My brow shot up. In my experience, Maul was just about everyone's type. But I wasn't going to start asking Tamar personal questions. If Sturmhund couldn't be trusted, then neither could his crew, and I didn't need to grow attached to any of them. I learned my lesson with Genya, and one shattered friendship was enough. Instead, I said, there are Kirch and Sturmhund's crew. Aren't they superstitious about having a girl on board? Sturmhund does things his own way. And they don't bother you? Tamar grinned, her white teeth flashing against her bronze skin. She tapped the gleaming shark's tooth hanging around her neck, and I realized it was an amplifier. No, she said simply. Ah. Faster than I could blink, she pulled yet another knife from her sleeve. This comes in handy too, she said. However do you choose? I breathed faintly. However do you choose? I breathed faintly. Depends on my mood. Then she flipped the knife over in her hand and offered it to me. Sturman's given orders that you're to be left alone. But just in case someone gets drunk or and forgetful, you do know how to take care of yourself? I nodded. I didn't walk around with 30 knives hidden about my person, but I wasn't completely incompetent. She ducked her head again, then said, "They're throwing dice above deck, and I'm ready for my ration. You can come if you like." I didn't care much for gambling or rum, but I was still tempted. My whole body was crackling with the feeling of using my power against the Nishovia. I was restless and positively famished for the first time in weeks, but I shook my head. No thanks. Suit yourself. I have I have debts to collect. Privyet wagered we wouldn't be coming back. I swear he looked like a mourner at a funeral when we came over the rail. He bet you'd be killed, I said aghast. She laughed. I don't blame him. To go up against the Darkling and Discretia, everyone knew it was suicide. The crew ended up drawing straws to see who got stuck with the honor. And you and your brother are just unlucky? Us? Tamar paused in the doorway. Her hair was damp, and the lamplight glinted off her heartrender's grin. We didn't draw anything, she said as she stepped through the door. We volunteered. I didn't have a chance to talk to Maul alone until late that night. We'd been invited to dine with Sturmhund in his quarters, and it had been a strange supper. The meal was served by the steward, a servant of impeccable manners, who was several years older than anyone else on the ship. We ate better than we had in weeks. Fresh bread, roasted haddock, pickled radishes, and a sweet iced wine that set my head spinning after just a few sips. My appetite was fierce, as it always was after I'd used my power, but Maul ate little and said less until Sturmhund mentioned the shipment of arms he was bringing back to Ravka. Then he seemed to perk up, and they spent the rest of the meal talking about guns, grenades, and exciting ways to make things explode. I couldn't seem to pay attention as they yammered on about the repeating rifles used on the Zemni frontier. All I could think about were the scales in my pocket and what I intended to do with them. Did I dare claim a second amplifier for myself? I had taken the Sea Whip's life. That meant its power belonged to me. But if the scales functioned like Morozova's collar, then the dragon's power was also mine to bestow. I could give the scales to one of Sturmhund's heartrenders, maybe even Tolya. Try to take control of him the way the Darkling had once taken control of me. I might be able to force the privateer to sail us back to Novi Zem, but I had to admit that wasn't what I wanted. I took another sip of wine. I needed to talk to Maul. To distract myself, I cataloged the trappings of Sturmhund's cabin. Everything was gleaming wood and polished brass. The desk was littered with shards, the pieces of a disembodied sextant, of a dismembered sextant, and strange drawings of what looked like the hinged wing of a mechanical bird. The table glittered with Kirch porcelain and crystal. The wines bore labels in a language I didn't recognize. All plunder, I realized. Sturmhund had done well for himself. As for the captain, I took the opportunity to really look at him for the first time. He was probably 4 or 5 years older than I was, and there was something very odd about his face. His chin was overly pointy. His eyes were a muddy green, his hair a peculiar shade of red. His nose looked like it had been broken and badly set several times. At one point, he caught me studying him, and I could have sworn he turned his face away from the light. When we finally left Sturmhund's cabin, it was past midnight. I herded Maul above deck to a secluded spot by the ship's prow. I knew there were men on watch in the foretop above us, but I didn't know when I'd have another chance to get him alone. I like him, Maul was saying, a little unsteady on his feet from the wine. I mean, he talks too much, and he'd probably steal the buttons from your boots. But he's not a bad guy, and he seems to know a lot about. Would you shut up? I whispered. I want to show you something. Maul peered at me blearily. No need to be rude. I ignored him and pulled the red book out of my pocket. Look, I said, holding the page open and casting a glow over Sankt Ilya's exultant face. Maul went still. The stag, he said, and Rusali. I watched him examine the illustration and saw the moment that realization struck. Saints, he breathed. There's a third. End of chapter 5. And we'll continue with chapter 6 next time, so I hope you all enjoyed those 2 chapters. I'm glad that I'm feeling much better, and reading's definitely going to be improving to about an hour again. So, looking forward to you guys, and I'm thankful for those that are liking my videos. If you have a comment about what I should read in December, please make a comment down below, and to show, and if you guys want to keep getting updated about my videos, please, and you are enjoying the series, please like and subscribe to my channel for more updates and more readings. I put up a new video the other night for my new kids series for kids books, and I'm looking forward to that one being a success. And I hope you all enjoy this wonderful day of Thanksgiving. Yes, Maisie. I hope you all enjoy this wonderful day of Thanksgiving, and see you all in the next video. Until then, have a happy Thanksgiving day, and we'll see you all later.